If someone asked you to name a queer icon, who would you say?
Britney, Christina, Shirley Bassey, Tina, Madonna, Celine Dion, Whitney Houston, Mariah Carey.
Bruce Springsteen.
This is Because the Bus Belongs to Us.
A serious journalistic quest to get Bruce Springsteen recognised as the queer icon we know that he is.
Listen to Because the Bus Belongs to Us on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey, it's Yowei with a quick note. So last episode, we shared the good news that if we get to 1,000 paid Patreon members by August 22nd, we unlock funding to support season 1 of Proxy. And since that announcement, we've gotten a bump in Patreon members, which is awesome. Thank you to everybody who signed up at $5 a month, $10 a month. The Proxy team salutes you. We're getting closer, but still have a ways to go. As I record this message, we've got a little less than 3 weeks till the deadline. If you want to help us make the show, consider going to patreon.com/proxypodcast and become a member to get exclusive monthly bonus episodes. If even a fraction of all the people who are listening signed up, we'd reach our goal and be able to get season 1 sooner to you. Okay, now to the show. Welcome to Proxy. I'm Yowei Shaw. Proxy is a show about investigating niche emotional conundrums through conversations with strangers who have shared experience. And this is part 2 of my quest to explore my own niche emotional conundrum. How do I explain my show to people who don't get it? Why would talking to a proxy who's not directly involved in your dilemma help answer your questions, give you closure? For the last year, I've been having trouble answering this question. But there is one podcast I sometimes bring up as a model.
There are people who hear about the podcast and their first reaction is, geez, get over it, man. Like, it was a long time ago and it doesn't matter. And I'm like, you're right.
Connor Ratliff is an actor and comedian. He's played a small part in a bunch of movies and shows you've probably heard of. The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, Orange is the New Black, Search Party. And just like me, Connor also made a podcast about getting fired.
And I have a lot of experience doing shows where explaining what the show is to someone that you want to participate in it can be a little bit complicated. In some ways, the not getting it is sometimes, it's almost like nature's way of telling you, like, maybe this person isn't someone who should be a guest on the show.
A few years ago, Connor made a podcast called Dead Eyes, an investigation into a niche emotional conundrum from his past, possibly the most niche you could get.
The idea of the podcast is based on a real thing that happened to me when I was starting out. I was just out of drama school. I was working as an actor in London, but not working that much. And I booked a small speaking role on the HBO miniseries Band of Brothers. And I was very excited. It felt like a very big deal. This was, at the time, like the biggest production made for television ever. And it was produced by Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks. And Tom Hanks was going to be directing the episode that my character first appears in. So I just felt like, I've got it made now. This is the beginning of a long and fruitful career. And the day before I was supposed to start filming, I get a frantic call from my agent's office saying, you have to get to London right away. Tom Hanks has seen your audition tape and he's having second thoughts. He thinks you have dead eyes. And so I was going to re-audition in person for Tom Hanks. And so I went and I re-auditioned for him. A few minutes later, I was told that I no longer had the role. And at the time, it was devastating to me. It was really embarrassing. I told everyone I knew that I'd booked this part and I was going to be working with Tom Hanks and all this. And so for a while, it was one of many things that made me sort of give up acting for a long time because I just wasn't cut out for it. This was my nightmare, like one of my favorite actors basically being like, this guy can't appear on camera.
After taking a long break from show business, which included working at Barnes & Noble for 13 years, Connor made his way back to acting for a living and eventually decided to make a podcast series trying to figure out why Tom Hanks fired him all those years ago. Like Serial. But the only thing that gets murdered is Connor's self-confidence.
But I also knew that the trapdoor part of it was that it would secretly be a vehicle to go from comedic narcissism to sort of genuine, like, empathy. Because everybody has something that is a story of their own failure that's interesting and important to them.
In addition to being a very funny and useful exploration of how to deal with not always getting what you want in life, Dead Eyes is a treasure trove of proxy conversations.
We didn't even try in the first season to get word to Tom Hanks's people. My fear was always that we would get to him too quickly.
Now, in a typical investigative podcast, one would be trying to get to the key player who can solve your mystery. And it's actually a common critique of mystery podcasts, like Serial Season 1, when the series ends with no definitive answer. But for Connor, it wasn't necessary to get to Tom Hanks.
I had a vision of doing this podcast for 10 years, and that potentially at the end of that 10 years, have an ending that would be about the fact that we never got to talk to Tom Hanks.
Connor managed to make 30 extremely enjoyable podcast episodes without one good-natured peep from Tom Hanks. How? I'd argue partly because he leaned into the proxy conversation. Connor talked to all kinds of proxies on his show. People like John Hamm and Seth Rogen, who have Dead Eye stories of their own as actors. And people like Judd Apatow and Adam Conover, who, like Tom Hanks, have fired actors from the shows they've run.
I really wanted President Barack Obama on the podcast because when you're in a job that's that important, you have to make a lot of difficult choices. Yet he also has had his fair share of disappointments. He's lost political campaigns. So it would have been really funny to me to talk to someone that important, that successful, and talk about his failures, but also talk about sometimes he's like me getting fired from Band of Brothers. Sometimes he's Tom Hanks having to fire someone because something didn't work out. How funny it would be for Tom Hanks to learn about the podcast and be like, wait a second, the president? Obama was on this?
Connor didn't get to the president, but by the end of season 3, he did score an interview with Tom Hanks, which means that Connor is someone who's had a lot of proxy conversations and has had the real conversation with the real person involved in a situation. And so without meaning to, Connor has run the perfect A/B test to help me understand the difference between a proxy conversation and a real conversation, and which is better. That's after the break. Okay, so Connor, in your proxy conversations, is there anyone in particular that shifted something for you or that gave you a bit of closure?
Well, like Stephen McCall, who was in the scene that I was supposed to be in. He played Moose on Band of Brothers. And he talked about how his experience on the show was really traumatic because everyone else, all the other actors were told to treat his character badly because it would create an interesting tension or dynamic that would work for how the characters really interacted. But they never told him that that's what they were doing. So he just thought everyone hated him and was mean.
People were just riding me, treating me like shit. I thought, fuck these guys. I fucking cannot stand this job. I want it to end.
And he didn't find out until years later when he'd been invited to like a reunion of the actors for some event. And he almost turned it down because he thought, I don't want to meet all those people again. They weren't nice to me before. And he got to talking to one of them and they said, oh, we were told to treat you badly.
But nobody fucking told me. It was like an acting exercise to get some sort of performance out. I found that out fucking almost 20 years later. And I've been carrying all this baggage thinking all these guys were fucking arseholes, you know?
Even though that wasn't anything close to my experience because I never filmed on it, I never actually got onto the set, hearing that one of the other actors had a bad experience on the set changed my thoughts about like, oh, if only I'd gotten to film my scene, then everything would have been better for me. Because it's not like him doing Band of Brothers, you know, it was a good credit to have, but his career still was like any actor's where it's a slog to try to get to the next thing, you know. It's not some cure-all that fixes everything. And in some ways, the experience of doing it might have caused him actually more anxiety and more sort of might have actually been detrimental to some of his confidence moving forward, you know, because he'd had such a terrible experience. So I thought, oh, well, maybe I would have, if I'd done it, maybe I would have had a bad experience that would not have eventually led to an interesting podcast, you know, that I actually got more out of it than I would have potentially if I did the show in the first place.
So like after I started making this show, I learned that in restorative justice, there are proxy conversations. Restorative justice is this like human-centered approach to accountability and repairing harm. And there's this important step where the victim and offender meet.
Right.
And when a victim or offender doesn't want to participate or can't participate, they can talk to a proxy victim or offender, somebody who has experience with the same offense, but is not directly involved in their situation.
Right.
And there's some kind of context jumping, this imaginative leap that is, it's almost like role playing in a way, except no one's acting. And I'm wondering, did you experience anything like that kind of magic when you were doing these proxy conversations?
Yeah. I mean, many of the people that I talk to are people who've had to make decisions that are similar to the decision that Tom Hanks had to make, which is like, we maybe need to replace this actor in this small role. Let's take a look. Yeah, I think we should replace him. And then let's do it and let's move on to the next thing. My friend Adam Conover was one of my first guests. And he was just very blunt about the fact that like nobody but you remembers this experience. It meant nothing to anyone else. And he knows because he's made TV shows and he's had to make decisions. He's had to make tough calls. And he knows that when you're in that position, that's just how it is. They can have all the sympathy in the world. Oh, we know it's hard to get fired, but you can't hesitate when you've got 1,000 decisions to make to be like, oh, I don't know, this actor's not working, but we don't want to fire them because they might really not like that. You know, there are times when you just have to be like, look, this guy's still getting paid. He won't get to be in the show, but we've done our due diligence. We're not obligated to put you in a show any more than we would be if we filmed the scene and decided that we don't need the scene for the show. You know, like we're making a show.
This meant nothing to anyone other than you. Nothing at all. Not a single person involved in this story thought about it again for the rest of their lives. I guarantee you, those couple times that I made a decision that resulted in, hey, can we lose this guy? I don't remember because it didn't matter to me, because all I was thinking about was what I had to do next, right? And making sure that shot worked.
Yeah.
And I am making literally thousands of decisions a day, and I don't have time to sweat every single one of them. I just need to have a workflow in place where when I have a thought and a decision that needs to be made, I tell somebody and then the thing happens.
Talking to people who've actually done that really did prepare me, and it was the same as when I talked to Tom Hanks and he's talking about things that way. And that is what actors are. When we're in a show, we are toys, we're puppets, we are tools that are used to help someone tell a story, express a vision. And if you don't look right or if you don't feel right, it's a job.
That's so interesting that the proxy conversation prepared you for your actual conversation with Tom Hanks. But like in the case of my show, we are just going to be facilitating proxy conversations and never the Tom Hanks version of the conversation. And I'm wondering, what do you think is going on there? Why do these proxy conversations give people closure when they're just talking to a proxy?
It's almost like the conversational equivalent of you either have a stunt double or you have someone who is a stand-in. Like they don't want to make, the star of the movie who's got to do all this acting stand on the set while they get the lighting just right. So what they do is they get someone who has roughly the same look, same height, same, complexion, same hairstyle or something. And that person stands in the spot so they can adjust the lighting. So you're not asking the actor to exhaust themselves before they have to do the scene. And, a proxy conversation can sort of be the conversational version of that, which is like, I'm not talking to the person that I want to have this direct experience with, but I am talking to someone who has an analogous power dynamic, an analogous relationship.
Yeah.
And even if they don't have exactly the same point of view, I still think the usefulness of it is like you're getting close.
Right.
This is sort of the next best thing. In some cases, I can imagine a proxy conversation. There must be examples where it's actually better than the real thing because you might just happen to have a proxy who's better at talking about it than the real person might be.
Right. Yeah, I'm thinking about in this layoff series I just reported, I set up a proxy conversation between the laid off couple and a proxy HR rep. They had a very traumatic layoff, and the HR rep is like the villain in the story.
Yeah.
They can't talk to the actual HR rep because the husband still works at the company. And who knows what she would actually say? Who knows if she would admit any wrongdoing or say sorry? But they ended up talking to this proxy HR rep who was like, I'm sorry this happened to you. This should not have happened. That was not okay. And there was that release.
I'll tell you, there was another proxy conversation that I had. I've done a show for about a decade now called The George Lucas Talk Show, where I pretend to be retired filmmaker George Lucas, and I talk to real guests who are themselves.
Right.
And one conversation that really stands out in my mind is we had Kevin Smith on during lockdown on a live stream episode. And Kevin Smith basically used it as an opportunity to talk to George Lucas about the facts that from the beginning of his career, he has made his Star Wars fandom a key component of everything he's ever made. Has Star Wars jokes in it, tributes to Lucas. His career has basically been an ongoing Valentine to George Lucas and his work. And he has never heard from George Lucas.
Oh, wow.
He always thought at some point he might like get a postcard or a, hey, I like this. This was fun. And it was, I think, an interesting sort of therapeutic thing for him to just say all of these genuine feelings, these genuine thoughts that he had sort of bottled up over the years. And then to have me as, in no way a realistic representation of George Lucas, sort of a fantasy version of George Lucas in this context. I basically gave him a response that felt good to him. And at the end of that, he was sort of like, that's kind of what I needed to hear. It was genuinely, I think, affecting to him that it's not the same as talking to George. He maybe will never talk to George at this point. If he hasn't already. So it's sort of like, in lieu of that, a proxy conversation can sometimes be not only the next best thing, but I doubt that his real conversation with real George Lucas would go better than what I delivered to him, which was sort of a much more attentive and affectionate response that I chose to give him. Whereas I know people who've had real life interactions with George Lucas that have been relatively like rude and cold, where it's sort of like, oh, hi, Mr. Lucas. Can I take a picture with you? Yeah, sure. All right. I'm such a fan. Well, good for you. And then sort of like, so in some ways the proxy conversation can be even better than the real thing.
And so in that conversation, what do you think was working about that? Like, why did that work?
It's like I was saying about like when you're explaining your podcast to someone and they're like, I don't get it. That in some ways it's a red flag that like maybe they shouldn't be on the podcast if they don't get it. Part of it is a proxy conversation is with someone who is interested in having the conversation with you. It's almost like the difference between a biological parent who doesn't want anything to do with the child and is not part of their life versus the real parent who is the person who is present and raises that person. It's kind of a similar thing, I think, with proxies in terms of like parenthood is showing up, it's being present. And anything beyond that is almost like a technicality. And I think the same can be true of if you can't have the real conversation with the real HR person who fired you and made this situation bad. If that person is not available, then almost any proxy is going to be better than that because a proxy is willing to have the conversation.
Yeah.
You know, and that's the whole ball game. And in some cases, the remove of the reality of it also removes a lot of the obstacles to a true conversation.
Right.
There are conversations that if you have it with a friend or family member or a stranger, the consequences of the conversation could be your friend doesn't want to talk to you anymore, or your family member doesn't want to talk to you anymore, or the stranger decides they want to take a swing at you. You know, like there's so many conversations that the real version of is not safe or it's not helpful. It's not productive.
Right.
Whereas there is something about the value of a relatively consequence-free conversation that gives you the freedom to speak openly. It's a safer environment. It's a controlled circumstance. There are advantages to it that are built into it. Reality is complicated. It's like a spider web. It has all these offshoots of like, well, if you pull at this part, it tears the whole thing down. Whereas a proxy conversation can be real in terms of your thoughts and your feelings and the way it affects you, but it still might not have the same ripple effect into your real circumstances that might even keep you from having the full conversation.
Right. Okay, last question. So you have done a lot of proxy conversations about your Dead Eyes mystery, and you also talked to Tom Hanks. Which was more satisfying? Like going on this whole journey, talking to all these people, all these proxies, learning about it, all these other people's stories, or the conversation with Tom Hanks?
It's a bit of an unfair example just because it's Tom Hanks.
Right.
Because the proxy conversations were very satisfying, but, and it's not just because, it's Tom Hanks, you know, 2-time Academy Award winner, beloved movie star, America's dad, like all of the affection that people have for the idea of Tom Hanks beyond even who he is as a human being.
Mm-hmm.
What I will say is that when Tom showed up to talk, he came to the conversation exactly the way we needed him to be, which is that he listened and he reacted, and I think was very honest with me.
When I found out about this from my daughter and my son, I literally said, how bad is it? That was my question. And he said, no. They both said, no, it's actually a really wonderful thing.
Yeah.
I mean, this guy is really taking this thing and has nothing but a great perspective. And at the same time, you know, an authentic version of what happened. And because yes, you were told I thought you had dead eyes. That's about as concrete a statement as anybody is ever going to have from anybody.
Yeah.
But I thought, well, I go right to the cheesy melodramatic narrative, which is like, oh, okay, so this is going to be essentially an ongoing poison pen letter. But it's not, because the people in the know, the people who live on Fountain Avenue, as I like to say, know that there's no room for that. You can't go there. If you do, it's the death of moving forward.
And he really delivered, even to the point of when he started sort of getting into playing the game of what if. You know, previous guests had sort of gotten into that thing of like, well, what if this had happened? Then this would have not happened.
Yeah.
And he had a very honest opinion about something that I had always wondered, which is I had just made a film with a very dear friend of his who's an actor that Tom had worked with when he was starting out. He'd done theater with him. This is an actor who Tom pretty much every time Tom has like directed something where he has a say in the casting, he has cast this actor in a pretty good role. Mostly, he's the Holmes Osborne, who plays the dad in That Thing You Do, and he's in From the Earth to the Moon, the miniseries. So anytime that Tom Hanks was able to cast this guy, he cast him.
Right.
I had just worked with him and had a very good experience right before I got cast in Band of Brothers. And that day when I was re-auditioning, part of me was thinking, should I drop Holmes's name in the room and say like, oh, I just worked with your friend Holmes on a thing.
Mm.
And I've always come down on the side of like, no, I was right to not mention it. It would have seemed like a real desperate Hail Mary move.
Right.
And when I told it to Tom, he lit up and he said, well, let me tell you, if you had mentioned that you knew Holmes and you had just worked with Holmes, 100% you would not have been fired.
Wow.
So I really genuinely learned something about, the reason I didn't mention Holmes's name in the room is because I was afraid that it would look desperate or weak or that it would seem weird. And I think it's a valuable lesson about fear. So the Tom Hanks conversation was the most satisfying conversation probably that I had one of the most satisfying conversations I've ever had with anyone in any kind of public, private forum.
I see.
As much as I enjoyed making the other episodes, there's no other interview that is quite on the same scale as that.
Yeah.
But that just has to do with the fact that he came and there's a million ways that he could have shown up and been jokey or not fully engaged. There's a lot of ways in which he could have been a letdown. But I've never been happier about anything than the fact that he really, as they say, understood the assignment and delivered what we needed and wanted. For me, what was so thrilling about it was that I didn't feel like I was meeting the fantasy version of Tom Hanks. I felt like I was meeting Tom Hanks and we were relating to each other as peers, not in the sense of status, but in the sense that we're both in the same business.
Right.
We're in completely different. I'm off in the corner in a weird comedy gutter of show business, and he's at this other level, but he also is someone who is comfortable over in the comedy gutter. He thrives over there. He's great at it. This is the guy who used to host SNL and do some of the funniest recurring characters that any host had ever done. And so, for me, it was meeting someone else that is great at comedy. Our conversation was basically, on some level, us throwing the ball back and forth. I can return a serve and he can return a serve.
So let's look at the stepping stones here. If that inner sanctum had been protected,
yep.
Meaning if someone had said, well, we'll never tell this, you would have got a call that would have been said, hey, this is great, but they decided to go a different way, and that would have been that. So if the protocol had been followed, you would not have had as fascinating a story.
I would have had nothing. I would have just,
wow.
I would have been fine. It's not like, I think things still would have worked out eventually, but it's been such a gift because we never would have arrived at this place if I hadn't had my little show business nightmare. It's been a real lesson in terms of even a negative experience can sometimes be the thing that is ultimately more rewarding than if I just had a lovely time filming for a day on Band of Brothers.
Well, isn't that the serendipity that you must have faith in? There is a type of seasoning of who knows what's going to happen, a pure unadulterated chance that moves stuff along somehow.
Yeah.
And it never stops happening in a career.
To be at a place where we're both comfortable in a room and we're able to understand each other and entertain each other, that's all I can really hope for. And one of the most satisfying things actually was after the episode came out, I sent him a little email that was sort of thanking him again for doing the podcast and letting him know that it was out and that people were really liking it. And then he sent a really nice email in response. And then about half hour later, I got a follow-up email from him that was asking, hey, who wrote the copy for that Manscaped ad? because there was an ad for a male grooming company, and I had written these ads where they were just filled with really, really silly wordplay, basically taking every Tom Hanks movie or TV title and finding a way to work it into a sentence about men shaving their balls. And when I got the email from him, I was like genuinely nervous because I didn't know whether he was asking because he thought it was funny or because he was asking because this ad makes a mockery of his entire body of work. You don't know how something's going to land with people. And I was like, I have to admit it was me. I did that. And then he was just like hilarious. He loved it. And that to me was like, I mean, at a certain point you want to like go disappear off the face of the earth because you're never going to get a better experience than that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for nerding out about Proxy conversations with me. And thank you for your work on Dead Eyes. Seriously.
Well, thank you for listening to it, and thank you for talking with me.
That was comedian, actor, podcast host, and haver of Dead Eyes, Connor Ratliff. You can listen to his podcast, Dead Eyes, wherever you get your podcasts. And you should also check out Connor's other shows, Tiny Dinos and The George Lucas Show. We'll put those links in our episode notes. Proxy is produced by Kim Nederveen Pieterse and me, Yowei Shaw. This episode was mastered by Kyle Pulley, theme music by Breakmaster Cylinder. And special thanks to Alexandra Dixon. Next week on the show, my quest brings me to the world of psychodrama, a kind of therapy that used to be a dominant modality in the US that feels very similar to Proxy conversations.
In the psychodrama, I got to say all the things to him that I didn't get to say in real life before he died. And I got to role reverse and become him and say the things that I needed to hear from him before he died that I didn't get a chance to hear.
If you are feeling convinced by the magic of Proxy conversations and want to help make season 1 of Proxy, go to patreon.com/proxypodcast and become a paid member of our Patreon. I'll say it one last time. If we reach 1,000 subscribers by August 22nd, we unlock funding to support the show. You'll get exclusive monthly bonus episodes and benefits we're still workshopping. For example, for one of the tiers, I promised an auto-tune shout-out, where I shout out Patreon members on the show with a heavy dose of auto-tune. But I'm not sure it's a benefit that anybody wants. To get a second opinion, the other day, I played my first auto-tune shout-out for music producer and Proxy engineer Kyle Pulley, who's also my husband. Okay, so do you remember how I promised this benefit of an auto-tune shout-out?
Yes.
And that was before I had ever made an auto-tune shout-out.
Right. Yeah. You know, we're just trying to get creative. We didn't exactly do any market research. We don't know if people want an auto-tune shout-out. You know, we're just had a gut feeling.
Okay, well, this newsletter called The Ink recently requested one from me, and so I made one. Can I play it for you?
Let's hear it.
This is my shout-out to The Ink. You asked me the smartest questions of all the interviews so far. I hope I did an okay job of answering.
Okay. Wow. I guess do you want feedback? Is this finished? Like, do you want me to...
Oh, this is locked and loaded. I sent this.
Wow. Okay. It's typically not when you bring a producer in to... It's like you're dropping the needle onto a pressed vinyl and you're asking me if I have any feedback. Sounds great.
No, come on. Be real. Because if this really is one of the membership benefits, then I allegedly will be making a lot more of these, ideally.
Yeah.
They're going to be on future episodes, which means that a lot of people will have to listen to them.
Right. I think if there was a more put together melody, but having the lyrics sound like totally off the cuff and kind of like...
Stupid.
Yeah. Yeah. Stupid. I mean, I think that could.
Okay, no, but actually, like, I have this question of, should I not give that benefit because, like, it's going to be annoying for people to listen to? Or should we do something else? Like, I don't know, a quarterly Zoom hang. I feel like that would be fun.
If I had the choice, I would pick the Zoom call. But, some people are even bigger introverts than you. And so they might just want the auto-tune.
So the question is, do you want me to make auto-tune shoutouts as a Patreon benefit, or would you rather have quarterly Zoom hangs with us? We want this show to be a conversation with all of you. And so, as we're making the show, let's hang as a group. What emotional questions do you want help with? What thing is a friend dealing with that you can't stop thinking about? Let's get a sense of our collective emotional world and help us figure out what this show is and get to know the other people who are here with us. I know which option I am leaning towards, but you can let us know what you think by going to patreon.com/proxypodcast and commenting on this post. Okay, see you next week.